This is Mae Brussell. It is tape number 857, May the 9th, 1988. I was going to continue part 3 on that very important article that was in Barron's. I was going to do that today. The article titled Rogue Justice, Who and What Were Behind the Vendetta Against Inslaw, I-N-S-L-A-W. Last week and the week before I did part 1 and 2, and there are very significant meanings to this article throughout the middle and the end. I've just covered a little bit. But I do want to get onto the subject of the week that will be going on for quite a while, but just touch upon it at this time, which is the astrology and the influence upon Nancy Reagan and her husband and the political implications of this matter, because this is very much in the news at the present time. I told you listeners of World Watchers for a long, long period, save your money, because as soon as Reagan is out of office, and I didn't believe it would happen so quickly while he's in office, there will be many, many books for years to come about this very odd, weird couple known as Nancy and Ronald Reagan. This is the show and tell time, and the usual broadcasters are confused on why these books are coming out now and not when they leave office from their very closest friends and closest advisors. And, of course, they want to be on the run and separate themselves when the feces spreads around, and there'll be a lot to hit many, many fans that are blowing right now in the wind. There's a new book out by Michael Deaver, who has been convicted of crimes of influence peddling in the White House. He was like a son to Ronald Reagan. Larry Speaks has his controversial book out, and Don Reagan now has his book out. And, of course, on the weekend you heard the commentators, if you listen, saying, why do they have this vendetta? And a few brave ones would say, but their children are writing books also. That Patty Davis wrote a book, and Michael Reagan wrote a book, and there's another book to come that is very important, and you've probably read about it. For those of you who haven't, I'll remind you of this character. The story of this book coming out is Washington Times, April 26, 1988, called More to Come. In the wake of Larry Speaks' book, the White House is waiting for 2 other heavy shoes to drop, and one dropped this week. President Reagan's one-time personal secretary, Helene von Damm, and his former chief of staff, Donald Reagan, are on the verge of publishing their ghost-written books, and there will be material and bombshells, especially about Mrs. Reagan. The First Lady had a hand in getting both of these people fired, and both are said to be hell-bent on getting even. Mrs. Von Damm was the president's secretary back in his days in California as governor. And keep in mind, I've done many broadcasts on Helene Von Damm. When the article says secretary, they don't mean a woman that took stenography and made appointments and told them who was on the telephone and called back. She made appointments not for the dentist and the doctor, those kind of appointments. She made cabinet position appointments. She made appointments that determined our future of this country, and they were very influential decision-making matters that she had no expertise in handling at all. And this accounts partly for the very political and horrendous appointments of the Reagan administration. But the article said she went back to California. She worked back in those days, in the early days in the California under the governor, and then went into the White House, and then became White House personnel director. That's where she was hiring again in Washington. And finally ambassador to her native Austria. She reportedly was replaced, at least partly, by the First Lady's instigation, and continued to raise Mrs. Reagan's ire in Vienna, when she again acquired a divorce, this time her 4th husband, and took on a new husband while she was ambassador to Vienna. She married a Viennese citizen while she represented America in Vienna. Mrs. Von Damm's new mate was running the world-famous Sacher Hotel at Vienna. His family owns it. And according to Nancy Reagan, this is an in-trade job. As the British say, this isn't considered high society by the aristocratic set in Austria. Well, I really am not familiar with the fact that Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan are aristocrats by any way, shape, or form. They come from very, very common people and common families. So their ideas of grandeur or the imperial presidency come down that they should have an aristocrat as the ambassador. There certainly weren't aristocrats around the administration, any appointment that they made, but this was the excuse for her not liking the new husband. Mr. Reagan eased out with a push from the First Lady. Mr. was able to push her out and there was a lot of scene stealing at the White House and so forth. So the Don Reagan book is coming out, and the Von Damm book is coming out this week. Von Damm will come out later. And according to this story, both the Von Damm and Reagan books may make Larry Speake's Kiss and Tell Chronicle seem like the gentle stories around Mother Goose. And I want to get back again and refresh your memory, and some of you know very well the Nazi connections to Helene Von Damm, and the Nazi connections in Hollywood and the astrology there is what I want to talk about. I'll get back to Von Damm later, but this was an article saying that the next one to get her book out will be Helene, and I understand in that book she suggests that she was Reagan's mistress and that Nancy was very jealous, or thought she was and was very jealous. So the story goes on and on. And of course, Time Magazine's article and the New York Times stories and the newspapers are filled with the account of Donald Reagan's books, former White House Chief of Staff, and how he tells that Ronald Reagan was hesitant, he was unassertive, that he was controlled by a scheming, image-conscious First Lady. Long listeners to World Watchers know that I have had Nancy as a control of Ronald ever since that prearranged, I believe was a prearranged marriage between agents, and that it was useful to both of their purposes, and that she was always in control of Ronald Reagan. Don Reagan says virtually every major move and decision the Reagans made during my time at the White House as Chief of Staff was cleared in advance with a woman in San Francisco who drew up horoscopes and made certain the planets were in favorable alignments. And most of you have seen these stories. They've come over the AP, the UPI, and the work of Joan Quigley, a graduate of Vassar, who's written 3 books, how she was introduced by Merv Griffin. Mrs. Reagan met Quigley, and she's in consultation with her. And Don Reagan seemed to be very confused when he moved in as former Secretary of the Treasury off of Wall Street to get into the White House scene where disappointed staff people waited around to make appointments while Nancy got on the telephone. And Reagan says that he was kept in the dark about these secrets, that Michael Deaver hinted how to get around it, and he color-coded days of the week when appointments would be possible, and that Mrs. Reagan went every Saturday to Camp David to chat with the soothsayer, etc. I'm sure most of you are following it closely, and that is the big story. Now, simultaneously with this story breaking, just this week, a man died. He was old enough to die. He was 88. He died of cancer. He was old enough to have cancer. But it was just coincidental. We won't be suspicious. We'll call it coincidence. The Carroll writer, the astrologer, and columnist passed away just the week that this book was coming out. And the scandal, if you call it a scandal, the situation of who advises Nancy and how Nancy passes it on to the Chief of Staff was just breaking. This book of Don Reagan's been in the process for months, say 3 to 5 months, and the publishers knew that this was about to come out. And at the same time, a man very close to the Reagans and Hollywood, Carroll writer, passed away. Now, he was a famous astrologer and a columnist, and he also worked with a lot of people in Hollywood, such as Marlene Dietrich and Grace Kelly and Terry Moore, who was formerly married to Howard Hughes. He moved to Hollywood in 1938, and he started his column in 1950. That was the year of the Korean War, when Douglas MacArthur was to make his big scene and his political push, hopefully to become president of the United States. And this is important. In the Korean scene, and the CIA was 3 years old, Ryder moved to Hollywood. And I met Ryder just a few years ago when I went to Hollywood to try to help Terry Moore write a book about her life with Howard Hughes and in Hollywood. After it was all written, I've mentioned it before on my programs, a family moved in, a man and woman, and took over the book. The woman was supposed to type it. She was a former secretary for Ronald Reagan, and she cut the book into shreds. And when I flew down there to see Terry and do some more on it, her husband sat in the living room with machine gun and guns around a chair, and it was an armed camp. And, of course, that book was cut up. When I met Terry, she said that working with her and helping with her book, we would first see that I went to an astrologer, too. Well, I went to see one. She set the appointment. A very nice lady who was absolutely amazing. She lived one block east of Fairfax. I remember the house. I don't remember her name, but somewhere around this house I have tapes. She let me tape record what she said. Terry had to see if we were compatible before we worked together. And while I was down there working with her, we went out to dinner with Carroll Ryder and got to know him, and he was to know me to see if I could work with Terry Moore. And that's the way Hollywood goes. You have your astrologers to see what is going on. We went to a restaurant on Vermont Boulevard owned by an Italian gentleman by the name of Sarnos, who was murdered last year. I believed at the time of his murder that it was a political murder. It was solved, quote, solved by a former employee and a drug arrest, killing him in front of his house for money. But I felt that he was very political, knew a lot of political people, and that restaurant was a mini Casbah of what you could hear or didn't hear. And that's where I was with Terry Moore at his restaurant with Mr. Ryder, a nice man, elderly man. Now, the story about Ryder, who works closely with these Hollywood figures, is that he was requested by British intelligence, by the William Stevenson group, to move to Hollywood from Pennsylvania and to infiltrate the movie colony, because Winston Churchill had a fear that Hollywood was being taken over by the Nazis, that London and Great Britain and the British Empire were in danger, and in 1938 he had moved to Hollywood. And William Stevenson sent out a man named Louis de Wohl, D-E, it's pronounced DeVal, but it's spelled W-H-L, who came to the United States in 1941. And Ryder was now in Hollywood, and de Wohl went to see him. Now, William Stevenson had set up an astrological movement of a few people in Great Britain. The purpose was to penetrate the Nazis in Germany and penetrate Adolf Hitler. And de Wohl worked not only with Winston Churchill, but he worked along with the astrologer for Adolf Hitler, whose name was Mr. Kraft. Kraft was aiding Adolf Hitler, and it was Winston Churchill and de Wohl who were blocking Hitler. Hitler got the wrong information about the invasion of Normandy, and part of that, most of you know that history if you've read books on Germany. He was ill-advised and got disinformation by the astrologer close to him, who was fed disinformation so that he was not able to stand off the British-American invasion of Normandy. So this Ryder, the one that moved to Hollywood and died last week and was the astrologer for the stars, was in Germany with Mr. Kraft, the advisor to Adolf Hitler. They either lived together or they went to school together. I'm not sure which it was, but they were very close. Ryder and Kraft were very close, and one was Hitler's astrologer, and de Wohl was the middleman disinforming Hitler's astrologer. Let me just summarize it again because maybe it's confusing. Kraft was Hitler's astrologer, K-R-A-F-F-T. De Wohl was Winston Churchill's astrologer, who was trying to block Hitler's taking over the world in Great Britain. So de Wohl, who went to school with Kraft, was helping to feed disinformation that got to Hitler. Then during the war, de Wohl came to the United States on the instructions of Winston Churchill to go to Hollywood, which was a hub of Nazis, and he locked up with Carroll Ryder, who had moved to Hollywood from Pennsylvania, and he was to advise the heavies in Hollywood on astrology. So this was a very political operation, and they set up an astrological movement of espionage in the intelligence community of astrologers that could influence political events in some ways, and they did, in fact, influence Hitler to the detriment of Hitler. In 1940, Ronald Reagan was co-starring with Errol Flynn. I mentioned that many, many times, and I refer again to the book that Charles Hyam did on Errol Flynn and the Nazis and Dr. Erban at the time that Ronald Reagan was working with him. Flynn was a Nazi working with Dr. Erban of the Gestapo. He worked in movies 1940 and 42 with Ronald Reagan, and in between those movies, which didn't take too long in those days, they were traveling around Dr. Erban and Errol Flynn. Now, I won't go into too many pages of the book, Errol Flynn, The Untold Story by Charles Hyam, but for those of you who don't have it or know about it, I just want to cite a few pages and quotations of the milieu that Ronald Reagan was working in and with Flynn at the time the British intelligence was worried about Hollywood. Just to cite a few pages, it tells about, on page 136, how Dr. Erban obtained photographs and names of all the German soldiers in Spain fighting for the Loyalists. He pretended that he wanted to help the Loyalists, and he was really working for Franco and the Nazis. And he took their names during the time of the Spanish Civil War, then sent them to Berlin and delivered them to Gestapo. So when these people disloyal to Hitler, and a definition of disloyal to Hitler is fighting Franco, they eventually would go home, be punished, be put into concentration camps, and murdered. Dr. Erban, as a doctor, went into hospitals and tended the wounded, people that were opposing Franco. Errol Flynn was a world-famous star. He'd visit the stricken men, give them good cheer, and obtained German veterans their names and addresses of families to tell them they had been wounded, sent them to Germany and sent messages. Meanwhile, they gave their name and address, and photographs were taken for the family, so those people that were fighting Franco were identified to be killed. And Errol Flynn lied to them and said he had brought $500,000 from the Loyalists and so forth, and got a commission. It was a cover from Hearst Cosmopolitan magazine and Liberty magazine to write articles on Spain, and Dr. Erban was supposed to be his assigned photographer. And the Hearst connections are important because they play a role with Marion Davies at MGM and Nancy Davis at the same time. And Dr. Loyal Davis was close to Randolph Hearst and McCormick in Chicago and the far right fascist element in Chicago. This book on Errol Flynn goes into a lot of details about the Nazi relationship. Another example is page 186. In October 1940, Errol attended a party at the home of Brazilian ambassador. It was full of Nazis, among them George Geisling, Consul General in Los Angeles, Fritz Wiedemann, Consul General in San Francisco. Federal agents watched Errol Flynn. Now, this is when he's co-starring with Ronald Reagan. During this period, Errol was almost constantly in the company of Fritz Wiedemann. In vain, a local member of the FBI tried to warn his superiors that Errol Flynn was consorting with this person, and that if he were really a loyal British subject, he wouldn't be doing that. And Errol had an intense love affair with a Nazi singer named Gertrude Anderson. And Errol Flynn also got an interest in the supernatural. And during this time, on the same page, he was making a movie, Santa Fe Trail, with Ronald Reagan. On page 210, the FBI failed to follow Erban and Errol Flynn. They went down to Mexico, got into Mexico, were top Nazis in Mexico. Read this book. There's a paperback. You can get it from Tom Davis at Research. You have the address there, and you can contact me. Most of my subscribers know that resource, and I'll put it on the sheet again for you to obtain these books. And at this time, Dr. Erban was correlating military and Navy intelligence, and 13 months before Pearl Harbor, we had no CIA. The OSS was just to be formed in 1942. Erban, the Gestapo agent, and Errol Flynn were working and giving away secrets and photographs of installations that the Japanese could use to bomb Pearl Harbor. According to Colonel Williamson, one of the leading figures of military intelligence in Asia, under General MacArthur, military intelligence was aware of Errol's connections with Erban from the beginning. And this is important because I'm going into Nancy Davis, and again, I mentioned her father worked with Douglas MacArthur and Charles Willoughby, the intelligence there. And so this time period before Ronald knew Nancy, he was co-starring with Errol Flynn, who was going back and forth with a spy, a German fascist identified by the FBI. And one other page, on page 212, in Mexico City, Erban reported to the General Counsel von Wallenberg at Gestapo headquarters. Located in a former convent, Erban connected with the Abwehr, that's the German intelligence, where he was given intensive training at a spy school where he did microdotting, which is putting a word, reducing it to the size of a dot and putting it under a postage stamp. Then he had a forged German passport under the alias of Alois Ecker. As a ship musician, he sailed from Los Angeles in February. Ecker was the name of a friend of his in Vienna. Errol Flynn was in Honolulu as the guest of Captain James Robb of the Pearl Harbor Navy base, taking films, photographs, and notes. For years, he claimed, a friend of his claimed he didn't know that Errol Flynn was in the Gestapo or working with the Gestapo, but it turned out that Jack Warner in the studio knew about this, and there was opposition to letting them make a film at our Navy base, but it was overturned in Washington, and Flynn made a movie at the San Diego Naval Base, called Dive Bomber, and of course this aided Japan. And in the period when he's co-starred with Ronald Reagan in They Died in Their Boots, Errol Flynn was frequently in Mexico. FBI agents trailed him everywhere. He mingled with extraordinary group of expatriates, heads of the Gestapo and Abwehr. By that period, 700 Nazi agents poured into Mexico from United States, Japan, Central America, and Spain. In the book Covering the Mexican Front, Betty Kirk wrote these agents were preparing for the Axis conquest of Mexico. German was on the streets, cafes, bars, and nightclubs. German drinking songs rang out at cocktail bars. Death to the Jew, death to Roosevelt. Errol Flynn's most frequent visits were the apartments of George Nicholas of the Nazi Party, his associate Hans Hellermann. Errol Flynn and Erban's Gestapo contacts were in Barcelona, and that's important, too, to the Nancy Reagan, Loyal Davis connections. Every effort to bug these homes failed. They were guarded day and night by the Mexican and German police, and Errol Flynn was flying to the Bahamas to meet with Axel Wenner-Gren, the owner of Electrolux, who gave approximately he made $1 billion from Electrolux, and was one of the largest suppliers of ammunition for Adolf Hitler, because Sweden was supposed to be neutral, and he worked through his friend Hermann Goering. So it was in this milieu when Reagan was working with Dr. Erban that the British, not specifically just those two people, were very concerned about Hollywood and sent an intelligence agent to work with the astrologers to find out and protect the British Empire. And this team of Mr. Ryder and the Hollywood milieu of the astrologers were there really to protect the British Empire from being conquered by the Nazis. And that leads to my hypothesis of what's going on with Ronald Reagan and the astrologers and the role that they're playing and have played through this administration. Now, also this past week, in addition to Mr. Ryder dying, William Gale died. He was described in his obituary April 26, just a week ago, as a tax protester, a white supremacist, and also they said he was a retired Army colonel. He served as an aide of General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. Now, there has always been a fight in the power structure between the Douglas MacArthur, and that's the John Singlau group, the Pacific group, and Charles Willoughby, that person who was chief of intelligence for Douglas MacArthur, to make MacArthur president of the United States. And these people worked with Franco and Hitler and the very far-right fascist element. On the other side, on the East Coast, was the control group of David and Nelson Rockefeller, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, who possibly have the same goals but don't call it fascism. They call it business, good for business and development, but has actually the same goals. They protected Nazis, brought them to this country, and brought Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig into the political fray. So at one side, there are elements that I call the Pacific fascists that want to control, and the John Birch Society and the Asian lobby that put in Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan came out of the China lobby, the World Anti-Communist League, the milieu of the Asian branch, as opposed to the Eastern branch. That's why those two presidents brought in so many warfare states and military dictatorships. They came from the West Coast. Maybe we're polished off on the East Coast, but there's always been a faction that fights each other. And William Gale was very active with General Douglas MacArthur, and along with Charles Willoughby, and Nancy Davis's father was part of that milieu. So at the time that Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan worked at Warner Brothers for Jack and Harry Warner, it was Harry Warner's son-in-law, Mervyn LeRoy, who introduced Nancy Davis to Ronald Reagan. Doris was Harry Warner's daughter, and they made the match for the two. Nancy Davis at that time was at a different studio under contract at MGM for Louis Mayer. And on other broadcasts, I've touched a lot of this before for you long listeners, but it's important in the terms of what this astrology, how it affected the White House and what the conflicts are with it, with Don Reagan not being able to break through. This woman advising Nancy, I just have to repeat this for new listeners, as those of you who don't remember, Ida Koberman, Louis' secretary, was simultaneously at the same time secretary for Herbert Hoover. They were politically active. She was under the care of Ida, as was Marion Davies, the mistress of Randolph Hearst, who worked with Loyal Davis in Chicago, that very far right-wing clique. Now, in the book that Don Freed wrote on the secret life of Ronald Reagan, that I've quoted many, many times, he says that Nancy told Ronnie, they started dating, and Nancy told Ronnie about Dr. Loyal and his lifelong battle against socialized medicine of any kind. Dr. Loyal had been in the Far East during the war. He was a friend of General MacArthur and his chief of intelligence, Charles Willoughby. Now, Reverend Gale worked with Charles Willoughby, and chief of intelligence, as I've had on broadcast and written before, is Mr. Carl Wiedenbach. I'll just refresh your memory on that. And back in Chicago, Dr. Loyal Davis was an activist in the anti-communist cause. So Nancy understood Ronnie, and this relationship of Loyal Davis to Willoughby and Reverend Gale and Douglas MacArthur is very important to the attachment of Ronald Reagan to Nancy as his controller in Hollywood. The articles about Reverend Gale go from saying he is mild and couldn't hurt a fly to his very far right racist activities, and I've had some of that on broadcast before. October the 30th, just a year ago, the late Gale, who died last week, was arrested with a group of 6 people in Nevada on charges of planning murders of federal agents. He was head of an organization now called Committee of the States. It's linked to the Posse Comitatus. He likes to call himself a reverend, and he received notoriety as early as 1983 in Kansas City when he was giving instructions to people on how to kill Jews and blacks and make roadblocks and how to kill them and eventually wipe them all out. In addition to serving on his staff, this Gale, the same person, was an expert in guerrilla warfare. He served in the Army until 1950. 1950 is the period when Otto Skorzeny was working for the CIA in Spain, and when top Nazis were brought to the Middle East to Nazify the Middle East and attack that new country, Israel, that had been created 2 years earlier. So Reverend Gale came to California to set up guerrilla activities, and I believe that the pattern, the SLA as the CIA, is some of the doing and practice of those people for eventually handing terrorism in the United States and creating a lot of confusion and new laws of rounding people up, and I wrote at length about that. In 1984, there was a long article about Reverend Gale, retired lieutenant colonel. We have a lot of these lieutenant colonels with a lot of power, who has a 96 acre plot, and he warned his enemies, "We will bury you, you Jews, blacks, and Asians. The world is for the white people." And he would say on the radio in Kansas City, "We're going to cleanse our land. We're going to do it with the sword. We're going to do it with violence." And he taught violence. He was proud of it. And he told the listeners to make dossiers on rabbis and league leaders and get these roadblock locations where you can set up ambushes for killing, and he kept arsenals of weapons. Gale came from the Pacific, from Charles Willoughby and Douglas MacArthur's group into California, and became a reverend and got a tax exemption for being a reverend. Well, he kept a stockpile of weapons and was teaching people how to kill, and was part of the identity movement with Reverend Richard Butler, who was at Lockheed working in the aircraft plank in Burbank for Lockheed, and became a reverend in the 70s. So this is the milieu around the Philippine group, and Nancy's father was stationed there working with those people. Now, when the war was over and we jump a few years later, Nancy and Ronald Reagan are married in 1952. 8 years later, a group called Young Americans for Freedom was formed, and you remember I've talked about that, formed by William Buckley, a Knight of Malta, a CIA agent with Douglas Caddy, whose offices, the Mullen Associates, were where the Watergate defendants were arrested. Their money came out of that organization. They were working for the Howard Hughes organization. YAF was formed, and as I've had before, as I say, another broadcast, 2 of the members of the board, the original board, were Charles Willoughby and Ronald Reagan. So the path of these people crosses, and the reason I get into these matters about Willoughby and Reagan and the Nazification of their mind thinking is then to take the astrologers who are assigned or attached to them to see, in a way that I believe kept the power off of Reagan to do the things he would do that could actually endanger the world, the entire world, during his administration. We'll take just a 1-second break, so those of you who have a tape can turn it over. No, you don't have to do that. It's not on the air. I'm going to turn my own tape over, and then we'll continue with the second. This is Mae Brussell, and it's side 2 of tape number 857, May the 9th, 1988. One of the advantages of just sharing these tapes with you subscribers, is that I can throw in certain personal things that happened or stories about Terry Moore. They're not on the air, and I can slip in, I guess you've noticed the language or the phrasing. It can be more informal, and I don't have to be so cautious, and I can put bits and pieces of experiences and people I've worked with that I haven't had on the air for obvious reasons. Now, this Major General Charles Willoughby not only was the chief of Douglas MacArthur's intelligence in the Pacific from 1941 on when Loyal Davis was with him, but he also in 1952 went to Spain and helped Franco, and then Dr. Erban and Errol Flynn connect there in Spain with Franco's army and the Nazis, betraying those Germans that went to go against Franco. And in Madrid, by 1950, the offices of Otto Skorzeny were set up that linked to our CIA, and then Miles Copeland of the CIA, who worked with Otto Skorzeny, is now managing George Bush's intelligence and can work right in if George Bush is president. And this element, this fascist element, has succeeded somewhat, very closely, in getting into power surreptitiously and hanging in there year after year, that they can influence our policies unless there is some other force that can counter what they are doing. And it took the brilliance of Winston Churchill to understand that maybe you needed astrologers to pick up what the forces are that would really ruin the Western world and put it in the hands of fascists. And Charles Willoughby, of course, says his name. He was the son of Freihard T. von Scheppe und Wiedenbach, and I wrote about that in my article on the in Rebel on the Nazis and the JFK assassination. And those of you who don't have that article can write to me, and I'll tell you how to get it. I went into Willoughby and his links as a phalangist, as a fascist, working with Franco, getting millions of dollars for Franco. Franco called them tokens. When the war was over, the United States, in 1952, America gave him $100 million, Congress did, and that was simply called a token. And Charles Willoughby was very close to the powers of the Asian lobby and that group and the fascists around the world. He was also knighted, a Knight of Malta. Charles Willoughby was knighted by the Vatican and Mussolini, and he got the Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem, the Knights of Malta, in 1967. He was among those very closely honored, and the officers of the Supreme Council of the Knights of Malta at that time, I have their names, are who's who of the very, very strong conservative elements that want to and wouldn't disappoint themselves if they put in a fascism. And luckily there are some people looking out for our interests. Now, just to run down the script of Nancy and Ronnie with the Astrologer and with the stories that will be coming out, and a lot of it, of course, I haven't read Don Reagan's book, but I have discussed the Reagans with you over the years and with my very close friend who speaks Reaganese with me. And I just want to refresh your memory in terms of what I think happened, the script of the astrologers, and why these successful people were able to move in and influence Nancy and Ronald. First of all, Nancy was always in control of Ronald. It isn't that she just suddenly had guerrilla activities. She always was from the time she met him, from the time that Jane Wyman was divorced for what I know are political reasons, and when he married her in 1952, he not only called her mommy, but she always was in control. The arrangement for this switch, I believe, and have stated before, was a decision made by people in Hollywood, by the corporate structure such as General Electric and the Howard Hughes Organization, and Patrick Crowley, the man who created the idea that Ronald Reagan would be their man to take into Sacramento and then to Washington. Crowley, a Knight of Malta with William Buckley and Charles Willoughby, etc., that he would be their anti-communist leader, governor, then president, and I'm sure they had a few other backups in case this one got sick or didn't remember his lines. Third point is that Dr. Loyal Davis was very close to those elements in the Pacific, and that when his daughter went to Hollywood and was married by 1952, this wasn't a coincidental arrangement, and I don't think those things happened coincidentally. Now, Nancy says she went to Smith College. In the biography of her, she allegedly went to Smith College. As I look back at these years and the years in California, I have never seen a photograph of her with a single Smith classmate. There were stories that she was there 4 years, but there's never a mention of a friend that went to Smith or this graduate of Smith or a cabinet appointment who knew her at Smith. And that's very unusual at these small colleges. Her astrologer went to Vassar, but I heard that she was a roommate of William and James Buckley's sister. But it could be that Nancy, during this time interim, had those missing years where she was trained by the Defense Department, the intelligence community, to be the agent that she became. I don't believe that she was on that campus, and if they gave her a diploma, it was one of those sheepskins that was created for her. I would just love to see a lineup of former classmates or where she fit in to Smith College. With her background and given her parents and her education, it's very difficult to think that she did anything but learn image, the image of early America, the jelly beans, the balloons, the flags, and has a strong, strong arm. So I would venture to say, if we looked a little harder, then I've mentioned it before, that she was a trained agent. Now, Ronnie was sent to mind control clinics. I've mentioned those. He learned politics. He learned how to avoid questions. He learned how to forget. He learned how to show America with flags waving. And as I say, everything looks like a big candy store at Disneyland with the jelly beans and infantile image and lots of red, white, and blue. When Ronnie moved into Washington, he came with a flurry. They tried to kick the Carters out in advance. They brought their hairdresser, the decorator, the florist. Again, all the images. And then the inaugural ball was put on, hosted by Frank Sinatra, the mafia kingpin. And then Ronnie, in office, ordained, crowned our new emperor and imperial president, could go about undoing every single thing that touched social progress from the time of Franklin Roosevelt. He said he wanted to go back to the period of Herbert Hoover, and of course Herbert Hoover and Ida Koverman and Louis Mayer, as I said, were very close, and he wanted to turn the clock back that far back. And in order to assure this presidency that this king could get his crown, he had to take former CIA Director George Bush as his running mate. And at that point, when he was inaugurated, January the 20th in 81, Reagan was ready at the first NSC meeting to go after Khomeini in Iran, Gaddafi in Libya, to overthrow Nicaragua, to put prayer in the school, to do away with the legalized abortion, and to prepare for Armageddon. Those religious prophecies were drummed into him by the religious right and Jerry Falwell, and up till 1984, it was told to him over and over again. Now, the Reagans don't read the Bible, they don't go to church, but this was fed as a necessity against the evil empire, and he was also fed material by Edward Teller of Western Goals and Helionetics about the Star Wars and the necessity for first strike against the evil empire. And the stage was all set for hell to break out. Now, what happened to the Reagans at that point? Reagan was no sooner inaugurated in 1981, January 81, then CIA Director Bush was fighting his turf with General Alexander Haig. By March of 81, the cover of Life magazine, Time magazine, rather, has a picture of Haig, the Vicar of Washington. They were fighting for domestic control if and when we go to war, using that federal emergency management. And by March 81, they'd been in office 2 months. The first open fight of the newly elected president with his team was in the news. It was Haig versus Bush, and of course Haig fought in Korea and Vietnam and was trained in the Philippines, and he belonged to that West Coast clique, and Bush belonged to the East Coast trilateral Rockefeller gang, and they were at each other's throats. Well, by March the 30th, with those guys fighting, and particularly the 2 weeks before the bullets went off, Reagan was shot and almost killed. And this is when the astrologer became an absolute necessity, although they used one in California or used them a lot. In fact, the story about the swearing in when he became governor is coming out now. Most people who speak Reaganese, we know that he put off the ceremony by 8 minutes, But there's nothing wrong with that, because if he did it, it worked. He went on to be president, so everyone should use an astrologer and take their oath at midnight if that's what it takes to get it. So the fact that an astrologer hurt him in any way is ridiculous, because he was able to keep quiet all his various scandals in California as they mounted and go on to be president. So in some way, he was reassured of his positive personality, and that astrologer didn't hurt him one bit. But as soon as Reagan was shot and almost killed, any ninny could read a newspaper and figure out the people behind it. I have one full filing drawer, 26 inches, and I'm not the Reagans. Remember when Reagan woke up and said, "Give me the demographic description of my assailant," and I did a broadcast on it? Well, the links of the Hinckley family to George Bush, of George Bush to John Connally, and that factor of Dallas, the Texas people that killed John Kennedy, would be apparent to anybody who reads their newspapers, and Nancy isn't dumb. So after all these years of grooming him and getting him into and inaugurated as president, within 2 months they were trying to kill him. And she needed an astrologer for advice. She withdrew from these people, and for all purposes began even to be, questionable about the environment around her. And also John Hinckley Jr. was associated with the Posse Comitatus, the Reverend Gale groups, and with Nazis in Texas, Illinois, and etc. So being on the Rockefeller Commission that investigated Kennedy's murder, and being close to those people that were behind the murder of John Kennedy when he was governor, Reagan was duplicating it with Texas. Vice President George Bush, just as John Kennedy had Texas Vice President Lyndon Johnson. And 2 months after the shooting of the president, the Pope was shot. And again, the pieces of the puzzle were in almost every newspaper if you read, and I'm sure people were discussing it. And elements of the Pope shooting involved Licio Gelli, who had attended Reagan's inauguration, and there was Frank Churchill saying how he trained Aja, and Theodore Shackley in Rome, and Francesco Pazienza of Italian intelligence visiting Alexander Haig just weeks before they were to, the inauguration would take place, and Haig became Secretary of State, working with Michael Ledeen. So the Reagans literally became surrounded by the very people that they thought they would be controlling, and they became more and more isolated. And as bad as the Reagans are, selfish, self-centered, blind to everybody else, they themselves were getting this treatment. And his only victory in his whole campaign of presidency, the whole period, was taking that poor little island of Grenada and killing Maurice Bishop, and he had no other accomplishments. Now, according to this book of Don Reagan, Ronald Reagan was angry at the information, and he said, "Imagine it coming out on Mother's Day." And the White House had a statement, "Vindictiveness and revenge are not admirable qualities and are not worthy of comment. Don Reagan's attempts to defame the First Lady on Mother's Day, no less, are certainly in this category." Well, it may have been Mother's Day, but where are the children? They went to Camp David on Friday. They came home on Sunday. 3 married children, 2 grandchildren. I didn't see one with them, and there was no report, just as the holidays come around, that they ever spare any time with them. So the effrontery on Mother's Day isn't the book coming out that time, Don Reagan's book, or the articles. It's that they really have no family, that they had put themselves into a box in order to have the power they had. They played every price. It's like Mephisto, the movie, or the story of Mephistopheles, and they traded their souls for this position, for this power. And then when they got it, the bullets started flying, and in total confusion they had to use and relied upon the astrologer. Don Reagan says, the quotation from the newspaper, "The former chief of staff said he regarded Mrs. Reagan's interest in astrology as a harmless eccentricity at first, but it wasn't until it impinged, in my judgment, to harm the president in the latter part of 86 and 87. Now that's the key. How did it harm the president in 1986 or 87? That's before the Iran-Contra scandal. What harmed the president in 86 and 87 is that Reagan began to turn away from that far-right rhetoric. Remember the KAL incident in 1983? By 86 and 87, he was losing that fascist agenda. It was slowing down. They were being moderated. And Reagan and Nancy began their activities, say no to drugs. At the same time, the newspapers were filled with Don Reagan's company, Merrill Lynch, being involved in heroin profits from New York going to Swiss banks. They got messy. They got into the drugs. She began to take on a cause. The cause could pinch some shoes. And Don Reagan realized that the Regans were moving into his turf. And what affected his judgment and harmed the presidency was the fact that they were taking on a cause now, and maybe getting even, taking on a cause that would touch these very people. Remember, it was Ronald Reagan who appointed Judge Kaufman to have a crime commission, and the crime commission named Don Reagan's company and also E.F. Hutton, the chairman of which was Scott Pierce, until recently the brother-in-law of George Bush, Barbara Bush's brother. So the president and Nancy maybe had this commission appointed that did investigate and identify those companies, E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch, as drug connections, and they were maybe sitting at Camp Davis and toning down some of the rhetoric as time went on, and also leaking, and they have their own friends and inner circle, and had Judge Kaufman do a job and a report that's there for everybody to see. I've quoted it many times, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and these articles tell about money going to Mr. Warredal that funded the man who shot the Pope, and those institutions are now getting slaps on the wrist for drug investments and transfer of money, not that they should. But the Reagans isolated these people and went into seclusion. Don Reagan describes Mrs. Reagan as presiding over a shadowy distaff presidency and using adroit guerrilla actions to achieve goals in a genuine belief that she was the best judge of her husband's interests. Now, she was the best judge of her husband's interests in getting rid of Don Reagan. And as I say, if I can figure these things out in California, just sitting here under an oak tree, I imagine that a very bright, astute woman knows much, much more. You can know that. She knows more than me. And what were her guerrilla actions? What would the astrologer tell Nancy that would be a guerrilla action or a change in the presidency in 86 and 87 when Nancy knew he was going nowhere fast and she wanted him remembered in history? There was also another shocking thing that happened to the Reagans in this time period, and that was the fact of the exposure of their friends, the Bloomingdales. You remember that story? I'll get to that in one moment. Just a few more quotes of Don Reagan, because she knew the presidency needed something to be remembered by. She wanted him to have a place in history, and I referred to that statue of him at Mount Rushmore she wanted. And all of a sudden, after the incidences in the Soviet Union with the explosion there at Chernobyl, the Reykjavik conference, the meeting summit was set up, and now Ronald Reagan, the man who hated the evil empire, has had one meeting with Gorbachev in Geneva, another meeting in Washington. Now he's going to Moscow next month, and he's going to have a fourth meeting with the evil empire. And he toned down his rhetoric. Gorbachev said last week, "I don't like what you're saying." And Reagan said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Gorby. You're really a nice guy." And he apologized and praised Gorby. And the far right is going bananas. If you watch Novak on Crossfire, the Sunday programs, Robert Novak, if you watch Buchanan, Thomas Buchanan, they say the right agenda is gone, and that poor Mr. Fine, that little mousy guy from Heritage Foundation, is trying to save the right agenda. They advised him, they told him, but I believe that Nancy was angry. She was angry he was shot. She was angry that these people have been deceiving them, and she's angry and needs these people that will tone down and advise, and maybe the advisors, these astrologers, were doing to her, giving her information that would keep Ronnie from being the warmonger. We've lost the Armageddon idea, the World War III idea. He was ripe with that if you look up the early speeches. And all of a sudden the Reagans had colon cancer. He had 2 operations. Nancy had a breast cancer. And they became more and more dependent upon the astrologers. And I can't see any indication that they did any harm for them in any shape or form. Their friends in California bought them a house, 17 people at 666 St. Cloud Road, and it was called Satan's House, and they changed the number. People try to do things or link them to certain associations, I suppose, but they are fighting for their turf, and these people have given them probably the only comfort they can get Nancy's closest friend, Betsy Bloomingdale, is hardly around her anymore. Now, the Don Regan story says that Mrs. Reagan's influence hardly stopped at lesser matters such as scheduling trips or speeches. Reagan said, in his account, she was the one who decreed that Vice President George Bush and National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane be barred from Reagan's hospital bed for days following his cancer surgery. Now, what is Don Reagan's beef? If she wants them barred, she wants them barred. There's no law that says the former CIA director has to come into the room and see her husband. As I say before, George Bush is a symbol. If you know the Hinckley, Connolly, Bush connections, she didn't want him around. He's the heir to their turf, to their throne, and for obvious reasons she didn't want it. And Robert McFarlane, you all know, he was an aide to Alexander Haig and worked on the National Security Council as advisor with Fritz Kramer and Sven Kramer. And Nancy's instincts and guts, maybe she just couldn't say it herself. Maybe she needed the astrologer to tell her or to help her keep those people away from him. And personally, that's none of Don Reagan's business. It's more of his business to find out why he took suitcases with millions of dollars from the Waldorf Astoria to his very agency and then sent them to drug dealers to pay for drugs that have zonked out the people of New York, Manhattan, and all around New York. It really isn't his business if she doesn't want Bush in the room or McFarlane in the room. And as I say, her dependence upon these people, which began long ago, could have a very good effect. Now, as I say, Nancy isn't dumb, and she has astrologers in California, and it worked. Time of the inauguration. In 1982, 1 year after Ronnie was shot and the Pope was shot, Alfred Bloomingdale, their long friend, was dying of cancer. Bloomingdale had been appointed to the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, that secret group, along with the late Roy Cohn, who died of AIDS and mental derangement. And before he died, Vicki Morgan, the mistress of Alfred Bloomingdale, was cut off of funds because Betsy found out he had been supporting her for the past 12 years. Now, do you think it's coincidence that just last week on television there was a 30-minute segment about Vicki Morgan, and even Edwin Meese was named again, and Marvin Mitchelson, the attorney, said there are indeed tapes of kinky sex in Washington, and it involves sadomasochism and whips and people tied up and defecating and urinating on each other, as I read in the stories. That wasn't on the TV. And they confirmed, yes, indeed, there are tapes, and that this Marvin Pancoast, who says he did it, that he killed Vicky with the baseball bat, is lying, that he has volunteered to say that he caused other problems. He's a great confessor under mind control. Now, most people don't talk about mind control in those terms, but his attorney and Mitchelson said the tapes exist and that Vicky was murdered so that it would protect people in the administration. 2 cabinet appointees and one that was put in by Ronald Reagan, 2 regular cabinet people and 1 other. And even the name Meese came in. This was on television last week. Pancoast was dying of AIDS. And then on this same program, it comes on twice a day in California, about 7 in the evening and then at midnight. And it's about unsolved crimes. And this segment was on Vicki Morgan. And the attorneys, no less, not just Mae Brussell talking about conspiracy, were saying that people in high places had Vicki Morgan killed and that these tapes exist. So why is this story breaking just at this time? I think that there's a lot of vengeance going back and forth. And if these people are going to do these kiss and tell books, more will leak out. And boy, are we going to have a good time. Now, with the pressures on them in Washington, as I say, with President shot, the Pope shot, and then the scandal of their very, very closest friends, they went into seclusion, and the Reagans led the most abnormal life that I mentioned before of any possible couple in America. They leave on Friday and go to Camp David. They come home on Sunday, and the White House is only for official dinners. The family stays away, and according to these stories, Mrs. Reagan chatted with her astrologer every Saturday from Camp David, and the advice the soothsayer gave, coupled with concern by Nancy for the health of her husband, was excessive, and according to Don Reagan, caused particular problems when the Iran-Contra scandal broke and his prostate surgery came down. Now, no astrologer caused problems for them. The problems came when Mr. Eugene Hassenfuss landed in Nicaragua and when a newspaper in Lebanon published the fact that Ronald Reagan and his staff, you can see Ollie North and you can see Poindexter and McFarlane, who personally went to Iran, and Michael Ledeen and agents of the Mossad doing things that were not in the best interest of the president, and as Poindexter said, doing things he thought the president wanted, and Larry Speake saying the things he thought the president should say, and they're sitting out at Camp David with the astrologers. Well, let's add up what the astrologers could or couldn't do if this is all true, that they sought advice, because making a speech on one day as against another is really nobody's business, and it's the same canned speech and is written on a little 3x5 card. So what is Don Reagan's beef? I know his beef was the Crime Commission. Reagan went into office. He was going to kill Khomeini. It didn't work. Khomeini's still in power. We didn't get a foothold in Iran. He came close to, he didn't kill Gaddafi. Gaddafi's stronger than Ronald Reagan today. He never balanced the budget. He promised to do that when he ran for office. Abortions are still legal. That wasn't overturned. And according to Don Reagan's book, there was a speech where Ronnie was referring to abortions, and she had him delete it. She took out the part about not allowing abortions. So in that way, we're all given a service. If you don't want to be knocked up by somebody or have a baby you don't want, she took that out of the speech. Reagan didn't go to bat for Judge Bork. Bork was furious that the White House didn't fight for him. We didn't invade Nicaragua, which was a fait accompli after the invasion of Grenada, his only great achievement. Fidel Castro is still alive, and living in Cuba with him now are Frank Churchill and Robert Vesco. Eugene Hassenfuss fell from the sky in Nicaragua, and that broke open the scandals of the administration and the defiance of the Bolin Amendment, and they were in fact arming the Contras. The Lebanese government broke the story about the arms for Iran, as I mentioned before, which matched the image of Reagan that he would never trade arms for hostages. So the astrologers did some good, and other things they didn't do. I don't see what influence they had, except overall it sort of castrated the policies that the Reagans had when they went in for. Their very closest advisors from early days, Lynn Nofziger from California and Michael Deaver, their, in quotes, son, have both been convicted of crimes. The former chief of staff, their children are writing books. The evil empire rhetoric has been slowed down. As I say, we're going to have a fourth summit and a meeting with Gorbachev. And Reagan's religious right that put him into office and went really as a holy terror until 1984 was pushed out, and the Falwells were pushed out. Reagan never went to church. He abandoned them, and telephonically they'd be in touch with their soothsayer, throwing out the religious right. Don Reagan of Merrill Lynch was chairman of Merrill Lynch formerly. As chief of staff, one of the most arrogant, horrible people, literally ran the country, was forced out of office. He's furious, and so he takes something like the Astrologer to get even at the Reagans. He has more to talk about than they have consulting astrology. And then John Connolly, a man who moved to Washington, formerly on the board of Permindex, a group that arranged the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, lost every cent he had this year and went into total bankruptcy. So what did the astrologers, how did they hurt that administration that we viewed from our point of view? It definitely was toned down. Reagan lost that angry rhetoric. And maybe, and I just say maybe, we were definitely headed towards World War III. And maybe those astrologers from Hollywood, Mr. Ryder and Reagan's friend in San Francisco and the other ones, were able to stop what they saw was happening, because what I saw was happening, and many of you saw, was how are we going to stop this mad dog? We were on the edge of the federal emergency management taking over this country, of a Reichstag crisis coming and influencing us and rounding people up. He could have created all kinds of situations. So I personally believe that the astrology movement of people very high up in this ilk, and it's been historically documented, were involved in politics for purposes, and I believe that the people around the Reagans toned them down when all things were bad. And maybe we should say thank you to the astrologers, the very ones from British intelligence who came to Hollywood, the ones that were assigned to disinform Hitler, that worked together, were certainly in touch with Ronald Reagan and Nancy, and maybe the calming period before the next administration is something that we needed. The highs were going for 4 years and then slowing down, and what Don Regan misses is that high of accusing and fighting is good for Wall Street. War is good for Wall Street. And to say these people were a disaster for Ronald and Nancy means they were a disaster for the far right, religious, fascist right, the ones we have to watch when George Bush is president. Then our troubles begin. I wish Bush had an astrologer also. So the time is up. I'll be back with you next week to do some more on Inslaw, but this is a very important political element, and it touches the Reagans and us in ways that are very subtle, but very, very important. This is Mae, and I'll be back with you next week to continue with some more of these stories about Ronnie and Nancy.